Yep.
Welcome to Prison Professors. And I love to do these master classes because it gives me an opportunity to introduce super inspiring people from all walks of life: CEOs, athletes, celebrities, people who faced crisis in their life but didn't let the crisis define them. And today I get to introduce you to Seth Sunberg. He's a fellow traveler, somebody who stood up for count and got some free room and board for a while. We're going to talk about his journey, not only what his career was before he went to prison, what he did while he was in prison, and more importantly, how he has used the preparations he did while he was inside to build a life of meaning and relevance and dignity, even though he served time in prison. And we're going to be working toward executive clemency, a pardon. And we wanted to have this conversation so that I could give some insight on what I know about the process to Seth, but also so that we could give it to people in prison early. And so it's never too early and never too late to start preparing for success, but the earlier you start, the better off you're going to be. So Seth doesn't know this, but I'm going to be relating this course to our introductory course, Preparing for Success After Prison, and showing you that these are not my concepts. They're concepts that I learned from leaders just like Seth, and we're going to talk to him right now. So Seth, I really want to thank you for being a part of our community. And why don't you just tell our audience a little bit about your background before we get into the crime? Tell us about your really quite inspiring background.
Sure. No, I appreciate it. Great. Thanks for having me, Michael. Honored to be here for sure. So I'm Seth Sunberg, 7 feet tall. It's hard to tell from the video, but that probably leads into where you can guess where we're going at that point. I started playing basketball at 12 years old. Was terrible for the first 2 years, and then really started picking it up. I ended up having a 7-year professional career, played with the Lakers, played in 10 different countries overseas, and retired in 2003, and then got into real estate from there, and worked on, ran a branch of a national mortgage company, had an investment firm that we were doing residential property ownership and construction in, and things were going really well for a while.
For a while, then they didn't. Then there came a time where they weren't going so well. Tell us about what happened.
Yeah, so in that process, I was arrogant, I was greedy, there was a lot of things that were there, just kind of from having the basketball mindset. There's both pros and cons of being a professional athlete, and I took that attitude, and it was at the beginning of kind of the 2008 financial crisis, and I saw some of the writing on the wall. Led me to start learning about more of the back end of the financial system, how things really work. We were doing $1 billion of loans, every year in the mortgage company, and I really never really even read one of the mortgage notes, fully, right? And so you start digging into that. Anyways, I started getting into the system itself, and it started to get, just make me more and more angry that I just felt we had been lied to and not told the truth about how the finance system specifically works. I had 30 or something properties at the time, myself and through the firm, and it was just frustrating. So in that arrogance, anger, and greed, I took on the IRS, and fought a battle with them and lost, and spent 5 years in federal prison for tax fraud.
So I think a lot of people in our community, they're not yet convicted. They're in detention centers.
Yeah.
And I think if to the extent you're willing to talk about it, could you tell us a little bit about the battle that you got into with the IRS, and what were you after? What were you striving to accomplish?
Yeah. Yeah, my on the surface it looks like it was money only. Really on the what it came down to was I was learning more, and people that are watching this probably understand this, is about the sovereign citizens movement, things of that nature that
For
come
those who
that.
don't know, could you
Yeah.
could you walk them through?
Sure.
I was in prison with some guys that went through
Yeah.
that journey, but like, how did you get exposed to that movement?
Yeah, so it was a slippery slope for sure. Because in about 2005, I started kind of down this path of going, all right, what type of financial system are we running? We're running a debt system, right? Federal Reserve notes is what we use. Everybody thinks it's money. It's really not money. It's just passing debt notes. That's the basic premise, and everything kind of falls underneath that from there. But I go, okay, great. Well, if I don't want to use the debt system, how do I use another system? And that's when I started learning about precious metals, specifically gold and silver, as tangible assets, but also as a currency, right? They're legal tender. And that, I started meeting people through that world, which is a very fascinating world in itself, and just learning more things. And some people are just really, in the beginning, what you think is just kind of far out, right? And you're just like, oh, there's no way this guy's lost his marbles, type of thing. But there's an element of truth to a lot of the stuff, and you start kind of cross-validating, cross-checking everything, and it just started going down from there. And the more I learned, the more I proved it wasn't true, the more I proved was true. I just kind of started going down the rabbit hole from there, and ended up, the more I uncovered, the more I was angry about,
did you go into that path or start pulling that thread that as you could be your own citizen and you don't owe income tax? Did you learn about that argument?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Wesley Snipes was probably the most famous case, right, that went down that path, right? And I went down that, and I took it a step further, and I went through an OID process, which is original issue discount process, which basically says that the like a mortgage note that gets created has no value until the flesh and blood human being signs on the dotted line, right? That's what gives that security value. Right now it's alive. Now it can be traded. Now there's value to it. So and then the original discount premise is, and I'm not condoning this or saying this is right, I'm just, don't go to prison is my message for sure. But ultimately you say, okay, I created this so you can claim it back, and you use the IRS to basically do the accounting is the premise. And I was like, well, sounds interesting. And I had, created a bunch of mortgages and things like that. And so I said, I'll try it. And my thought process was not to go, hey, I want to get all this money or just get more debt notes or whatever you want to call it. And retire. I was making, career was fine. Assets were fine. Everything was fine. Had a good life. Was engaged to my daughter's mom at the time. Everything was good. And, went to but my premise was, my thought process was really one of two things, and then a third thing happened. But I was thinking, okay, either I file this way and they say, no, you can't do that, that's the wrong way to do it, and they send me a fine for a frivolous filing letter, and I refile, and I pay the $5,000 or whatever it's going to be, and I go, great, that got proven wrong, or to not be true, or to not work. Fine, that's fine. Or it would work and it would be true. And, I just file my returns from that way. And I've basically figured out the whole financial system, right? And just continue to live life. The third thing actually happened is it worked. They sent me a refund check for $5.7 million, which I said, great. I figured out the system. And I just kept doing business as usual. Nothing really changed. It wasn't like I said, life-changing money at the time or anything. It was just going great. I figured out the system. And 4 months later, they levied all my accounts, arrested me, and then I never saw the light of day from there.
So the reason I asked Seth to give us those details was because I think a lot of people in prison, and I've known a lot of people. I've been out of prison for 12 years. And prison understandably can obliterate your hope, and it could start leading you down a path where if something just has a sliver of truth, you kind of want to grab onto it and say, they can't do this. Used to hear that all the time in prison. They can't do that. Right.
Yeah, it's not fair. Yeah.
And whether they can or they can't, that's never my call. I never make a judgment call one way or the other, but I will say, as somebody who did 26 years in prison, be very cautious about doing anything because we're a target. When you go into that system, we are a target. For the rest of my life, I know I am 16377-004. That's who I am. And I have been attacked, not for doing anything wrong, but because of my history of being in prison and then becoming financially successful on the other side. So I'm super cautious about any types of pathways that might be unconventional. And I try to say, how could I protect myself? Which is why I create a lot of information and content on Bitcoin and blockchain, because we have to protect ourselves. When we've gone into this system, we have to protect ourselves, because the danger is that you get sucked into some type of an idea, and you have an experience like Seth had. Now, Seth wasn't even a felon at that time, but now you've gone through the journey and you came home. And when we first connected, I didn't remember how we first connected, but I definitely remembered you because you were an entrepreneur and you'd built a business which was super cool called Prison Bars.
Yeah.
And I'd love it if you told our audience a little bit about that experience. Well, first of all, tell us about your journey through prison. You did 5 calendars in prison or longer?
Yeah, 5 years in prison.
On how long of a sentence?
I think it was 71 months was the total sentence, and I ended up doing, I think,
60.
63.
So very different law from today, where we have the first step back and we have opportunities for people to earn freedom through merit. But at that time, on a 71-month sentence, you'd do 60 months. That's just statutory good time, less any halfway house time. But tell us about the journey, what you did while you were in there.
Yeah. One of the things, to your point earlier, Michael, too, was, the holding on to that sliver of truth in anything, right, type of thing. There's so many people that I met during prison that were like, I heard what you did. Teach me how you did it. And I go, there's no way in God's green earth I'm teaching you anything.
Sure.
Like, I'm wearing the same color clothes as you.
And that can just so people know, that's what can lead to a conspiracy charge, right? Oh, Seth taught me, and then I did it. Okay. Well, Seth knew you were going to do it, and boom, you're another indictment. Okay. So be very conscious of the choices you make, the friends you choose, the things that you do. And just understand, I'm not ever advising somebody, how to live their life. Just as somebody who did a quarter century in prison, I would say, be cautious.
Yeah. Watch your company for sure. So my 5 years, the first 2 years, I had zero accountability in the process. I was blaming everybody else. I blamed this, I blamed that. Everybody else was wrong. I was right, yada, 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 yada. And I went through that. And it wasn't really until I read a book called Outwitting the Devil by Napoleon Hill. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a great book. And they had a quote in it that said, every tragedy carries with it the seed of an equivalent benefit. And that, at first I was like, that's just BS. I don't believe that, right? That's crap, just mumbo jumbo. And then I started going, well, yeah, maybe it's not true, but what if it was, right? This is a big tragedy, right? I was engaged. I was, had a good life, hurt my family, hurt my friends, hurt myself, in the process, all the impact pieces that were there for everybody. And I said, what would be potentially the equivalent benefit? So I started looking for those things. And then I started seeing them, and I go, wow, I have all this time. I can learn how to play guitar. I've always wanted to learn how to play guitar. Awesome. I can read all these classic books. I can do this. I never finished college because I went to go play pro basketball, right? So I can start working on that. I can do all these things where I just started taking advantage of the time and the opportunity versus blaming everybody and versus, taking no responsibility. And that ultimately led to going, the epiphany moment was, wow, shit, I'm responsible for everything that I've done right here, and nobody else is responsible for it. It's all me, and that started just changing the way that I, view life ultimately. And that's how I look at it to this day too.
And so your journey through prison, did you participate in any of the classes, or just kind of get through there and try and avoid disciplinary infractions?
No, I did every class under the sun. Like I said, guitar, took language, took, all the wellness classes. I started going to junior college outside. I got a couple of associate's degrees, read over 500 books during my time down. I'm a Christian, and so I read the Bible, front to back 3 times, which I had never really done before. And I grew up as a Christian. I went to Christian school, right? And never just read it like a book, from the beginning to end. So that was great. And yeah, it wasn't all, puppy dogs and ice cream cones for sure, but it was definitely, just having the framework shift of going, all right, there's an opportunity here. I got in pretty good shape, took advantage of, whatever food we could find that was semi-healthy, started making protein bars, in prison. And that's how Prison Bars started,
Tell us about that. What were you making in prison and how?
Yeah. So we Well, it started because, and I was in the federal system. I was in Texas at the time, and I went, I was working in the kitchen, and I went to the back freezer to pull out a box of chicken. I think it was a Thursday, right? So it was chicken day for lunch, and I pull out this box, and on the box in big bold letters it says "not for human consumption" on it, and it just shocked me, right? I was like, wait a minute, this is not, I'm not serving this. Like, what are we talking about here? And
You
the
see, my
CEOs are
wife,
like,
just to give some feedback, my wife throws stuff out of the refrigerator after 3 days. I said, in prison, it didn't matter if it was 5 years old. What's the big
yeah,
deal?
exactly. You try and get whatever nutrients you can out of it, for sure. So I told everybody, and I was serving the line, and I said, hey, chicken said not for human consumption on it, and most people didn't care. At that point, I never ate the chicken again, and I said, all right, well, that's I need to still replace those calories with something, right, to be able to be as healthy as possible. And so I said, all right, let's start making some stuff off the commissary, and so we started making protein bars. We were using granola and oats and the angel nut mix that they had, and we mixed in some of that with some honey and some other things, trying to make it as the healthiest product we could, just for a friend of mine and I inside. And other guys were like, hey, what are you making? I want to buy some, let's do this. And next thing you know, we had people in one unit making them. We had sales guys in other units selling them out in the yard. We were collecting the books and doing collections and everything. And it was a full business. And so I took that. And when I got out, I started with zero. And I was a basket case, honestly. I just wasn't, prepared for what the world had, changed in just the short time, the 5 years that I did. And it was difficult, but
did you
I
have
used that.
financial resources when you got out?
I have family for
Okay.
sure and friends, but there was nothing. I didn't come out to anything.
So you were starting from zero.
Starting from zero for sure.
And you were going to launch this venture. Tell us how did you have to raise capital to launch the venture?
Yeah, so I wasn't really sure. I knew that I wanted to, to talk. I wanted to use it for two things. I wanted to build a business out of it to try and, try and drive, revenue and value and profit and all those things on the business side. But I also wanted to use it to be able to get the message out there, right? I never been in trouble before, and I got in trouble with taxes, and I learned a lot in the process, and I wanted to get that out, just to get that message out there for to see how to make it better, right? And there's a ton of inefficiencies. There's a ton of stuff that doesn't make any sense, in prison, right? And so I wanted to have people have those conversations, right? People that may not have been exposed to it in other ways, but they go, oh, what's prison bars? Oh, it's some guy that used to play pro ball and went to prison and then started a protein bar company called Prison Bars. It's an interesting story, and now they're talking about prison stuff, right? And they're talking about, well, this is screwed up, or my friend did that, or how do we fix that? And you get enough people, thinking about that, right? And systems change. So that was the kind of double bottom line piece that we were looking for in doing it. And like I said, when I got out, I had zero resources, but I had read about Defy Ventures and Catherine Hoke, who was running Defy at the time, and what they were doing. I read about it inside. I said, when I get out, I'm gonna connect with them and see. And at the time, they were only on the East Coast. They were only in New York. But I'll say coincidentally, but I don't believe in coincidences. 2 months after I get to San Francisco at the halfway house, there was a friend sent me an article saying that Defy was launching in San Francisco. I said, great. It's awesome. At the time, they were charging, I think, $150 application fee to get into the program. And I think I had $186 to my name. And I said, all right, I'll pay the $150. I'll have $36 left to my name, and I'll figure out how to eat and do the whole thing later. But I knew this was a thing that I wanted to do. And
so where
it was great.
Where was Defy based out of? In San Francisco?
Yeah, so they were in San Francisco.
But where did they get space?
In San Francisco. They got sponsored by Google, so they're using Google's office space and co-working space.
Okay, so you would go to Google, and how many guys were there?
Yeah, at the first there was like 8 or 10 of us in each cohort that was going through it.
And they would teach you entrepreneurial mindset and that kind of thing?
Yeah, entrepreneurial mindset, but also accountability. One of the most powerful lessons that I learned through Defy was how to apologize properly. And it was just, it's something, one of those things that was like, it was more than just business, right? Is my point. But it was like, and I used it with my daughter, who was 7 at the time, and it opened up a lot of, conversations and I think healing, in that. So there's a lot of those business for sure, and other prison related specific courses.
How often did you guys meet?
We met at least once a week live, but we had courses to go through, right? So it was recorded programs and things like that you're required to go through. There was accountability sessions, there was things like that, and then you get partnered up with groups in your cohort. So we met as a whole team, a San Francisco division cohort at least once a week, but we were meeting with our teammates, at least a couple times a week.
And how long was the program?
I was in it for a year.
Was the only fee the $150 application fee, or did you have to pay additional to that?
The only fee was a $150 application fee, and they used it more as a vetting thing to really kind of go and say who's serious. Their model is different now, and the founders have changed, or the executive directors have changed, and they've grown and contracted and grown again. But they also gave grants, right? So it was a real incubator. You get through each stage, you get an opportunity to do a pitch competition at the end of each stage. And at the time they did it based on blue belts. Kat was a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt. And so she based her program based on the different levels of belts. And then at the end, you get a chance to pitch to actual, venture capital investors and things like that. And none of the businesses that were running there were VC style, tech style investments. But there was a lawn care company. There was my company was a protein bar company. There was another guy that was working on doing delivery experiences and things like that. So it was small businesses, but it was real investors and great contacts, and it was a lot of fun. And one of the things that was great for me, I didn't know anything about running a food business, right? I've run businesses before, but a food business was a totally different animal that I learned a lot in. But it was really, really forced me to tell my story a lot over and over again and just get comfortable with it. And, when I got out, and I had done some things in the past, but I got out and I was like, I am worthless, right? I have nothing to offer anybody. My family hates me. My friends hate me. I've been a leech on the system, and my family and people I care about for a long time. And I just felt worthless. And in telling my story, having the radical ownership, going out there is like, people are like, man, I'm so inspired by this. And I'm like, well, that's awesome. I'm living in a 400 square foot SRO right now. I don't know what's really to be inspired about, but they were like, you're doing this, you're resilient, you're getting through it. And so I started to feel like, okay, maybe I can offer people something. Right. And, that was kind of the message, and it helped me. It was very cathartic, and it helped me kind of grow back into, really knowing who you are and who I am, and moving forward from there.
So my understanding then of this program is that when you got out, you went to Defy, you had some mentors there that taught you classes. They had some structured material as well. And at the end, you would have a business plan that was pitch ready for like a demo day where you could present it live to prospective investors who may or may not choose to invest. Is that right?
The process is right. It's more than that. It's more accelerated. So the thing that, if anybody's working on an idea or a company, and this, Michael, too, right? Like, the number one thing to focus on first and foremost is sales. Sell your product before it's ready. Sell it before you're comfortable with it. Get it out into the marketplace. Let the market give you feedback, right? So that's what Defy was about, right? And that's what Y Combinator. I've worked with Y Combinator companies, as you know, and that's what it is. Don't worry about swag. Don't worry about your brand. Don't worry about this and that. Just get it out into the marketplace. Get your product out there, and then get that feedback from the market. We like this, we don't like that, and make your adjustments. And so in Defy, the biggest thing that carried weight was traction, right? How many protein bars did you sell? How many boxes did you sell this week? That was the thing that mattered. So it was much more, the first part was the ideation to the business plan, and then it was to launch, and then it was from launch to scale, and moving forward from there.
Could you tell us, if to the extent that you remember, what was the cost that you needed to raise to build your first box of protein bars?
No. Yeah. So initially we did again, launch before you're ready, right? That mentality. I basically found the exact ingredients that we were using inside prison, outside prison. And you'd think that'd be a lot easier than, to find the stuff inside, outside prison than it would be to get inside prison, but it wasn't. There was specific brands at the time. I'm not sure if it's still the same way now, but at the time, and they only sold to prisons. So I remember calling a company that had the nuts and it was a specific blend and had all that stuff in it, and I wanted to use the exact same stuff to make the bars outside, and I said, hey, I want to buy some some product from you. And they say, are you buying it for yourself? And I said, yeah. And they said, no, that's not how we work. We only sell to prisons.
Mm-hmm.
I said, what? I said, no, I have some money that I want to give you, right? You give me the product and you made a sale. Good job. Like, let's go. And they wouldn't sell it to me. So I ended up figuring that out. But we made the bars just like we did inside by hand. And we sold, a couple thousand of those. And then from there, we said, all right, we need to make a commercial version of this. And, that was tough, but that's when we started really raising money.
And did you sell primarily online, or did you try to develop relationships with the big retailers like Whole Foods or Ralph's?
Yeah, because the initial version was a handmade bar, right? We were under the cottage food law, right? So, and people could put orders in online, but we had to go actually physically deliver it. So we were only delivering to the San Francisco area, and then when we got a commercial version, we had a protein bar manufacturer at one place. We'd have them shipped to another spot, and they would go from the fulfillment center there, so people could buy online.
So it was a tough business to get rolling, and it could only get rolling if you had massive sales. Is that?
And volume is the key, right? I mean, we sold, for our there was 12 bars in a box. Each bar we made for $1.25, and we sold it for between $2.50 and $3.25, right? And that was so you got, right there, you got a 50% gross margin, right? And then you have payroll, you have all these other things to pay out, right? It's just, you got to get to volume, and that was the thing that was difficult, right? And it's, you got to have a special product. I think the story was really good and our original product was really good, but it was hard to translate it into a commercial, version. We've since adjusted it and changed the name of the company and focused on some supplements and things like that. But I'm thinking about going back to prison bars actually on that and seeing if I can restructure it. But but I learned a lot in the process. And it's just,
did you use always your own funding, or did you actually go out and raise capital?
We raised capital. We didn't raise that much capital. We raised less than $500,000, to do it. But
did you raise that capital as equity or debt?
Equity.
Equity. So you sold a piece of the intellectual property, and then
we use safes. If you're familiar with what YC uses.
I'm not. So why don't you tell our audience what that is?
Yeah. So a safe is a convertible note ultimately. So it's debt at zero cost that converts to equity once you have a valuation round. So it's basically the easiest way to just go, look, you want to put in $15,000, $20,000, $100,000. Great. Do that. Once we get a priced round, then you'll understand what your equity position is. Right. Until then, if anything happens, it's debt at like a 4% coupon. Right. So, but it's not that you don't pay any debt. There's no debt servicing on it. It's one of the things that YC created. And so we ended up using that just because it's like nobody knows what the value of an early stage company is. And it's not really what founders should be spending time on, early stages. Shouldn't be worried about swag. Again, don't worry about your logo. Don't worry about even, the legal. I hear so many, people that have business ideas and they go, great, I want to start this idea. And it's a good idea or a good product or whatever it is. And they go, I'm having a hard time structuring my LLC or, working with this. Like, just get it out there, right? Just you have your intellectual property. As soon as you start doing business as that thing, and you can do it as a sole prop at first, right? You don't need all that stuff. Get it out into the marketplace first and foremost. Get that feedback, because your first product is never going to be what the market wants. It's just you're going to iterate it, right? you're going to change it. So work on that stuff once you get out there and get a good product on.
And because you raise it as a safe, does that mean the entity still has debt, or did they write it off after this length of
It's
time?
written off now. Yeah.
So if you launch it, you're effectively going to just start all over again.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so that lasted for how long, that venture?
Yeah, I did that for 3.5, 4 years. And I was going to school at the same time. And then my probation officer, and I was going through Defy. I was working on prison bars, going to school, and my probation officer said you had to get a job also. And I said, I'm doing all these things, like, and he's like, no, you gotta work too. I said, all right. So my cousin owns a laundromat, and I said, hey, I need a place that I can study, that I can get whatever I need to get done, for work, but also study, work on the company and do things. And she said, all right, come here. So I cleaned the laundromat, for a couple hours a day, and talked to her customers and worked on driving her sales and helping her out, there too. But it was great because there was an office in the back. If people needed my help, they knew where to find me, and I could get my studying and work on the company and make the phone calls that I needed to make.
And then I know you did some other work with 70,000 jobs. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah. It's so 70 million Resources was the parent company, and Richard Bronson was a guy that I met who was a director at Defy, and we became close friends. He branched off from Defy and went and took this idea of a national employment platform for people with criminal histories to Y Combinator, got accepted. And then after he got out, we were talking. I was just, over the moon about what he was doing. One of the reasons I wanted to grow prison bars was to get the message out there, but also to create jobs for people with records, right? Because it's so difficult, with that record. It's much better now than it was, 11 years ago, but still a lot of things. So when I started working with Richard, it was 2017, I think, and we started building that. And it was hard in the beginning, right? Like any startup. And then we built a staffing division because we realized that's the way that employers wanted to hire people with records, to give to say, hey, we're gonna test this out. And one of the things that I used to tell large employers that we were working with, it was a national staffing company, the first national staffing company specifically built for people with criminal records at the time. And one of they'd ask me all the time, like, hey, I don't really feel comfortable accepting somebody that's committed murder or this and that. I go, hey, people that have been charged and committed murder and been charged and convicted of that are probably going to be your best employees, right? Because they're going to do it once, and if they're out, right, the system has deemed them to be eligible for reentry, right, and out, and so they've gone through a lot to get there. They're going to be trustworthy. They're going to be grateful, right, for the opportunity, et cetera. But regardless of whatever people's crimes was, I used to tell them, you're really looking for two things, right? You're looking for ownership and drive. If you find somebody that says everything that's happened to me is my fault, I'm responsible for it, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make that up and move this thing forward, right? That's what you're looking for. And everything else can be teachable. Everything else is skills that can be learned, right? So we built that out. We launched it in January of 2020, and then 3 months later, we had our most the highest gross revenue month ever in February of 2020 of the whole company. And then COVID happened and changed the job landscape for everybody.
How many how many people did you actually place in jobs?
So we helped facilitate thousands of employment positions for people with records through the tech platform, right? We were the intermediary for that. And then we had at the peak when we started launch in January to March of 2 months, we had 54 employees, at that time. And then we were still growing, and again, then everything changed.
COVID changed everything.
Sure.
But it didn't block you. You continue to find your path. And I'd love for you to tell our audience about that. Continue telling us about that employment journey that took place following
Yeah, so I got back a couple of things. I got back into, said in 2017 while I started working with Richard. I also wanted to get back into real estate, and I didn't want to go back in on the residential side where I was. So I went back into real estate on the apartment side, and was able to grow a portfolio there. Learned a lot about how apartments work, things like that. And like I said, I hadn't done that in the past. And when COVID happened, I just focused on real estate for a year or two, and we were working with when I was with 70 million with Viapath at the time, working on getting our information into the prison tablets there for job growth, and um, then 2 years later, Viapath called me and said, "Hey, we have an opportunity here. We loved working with you previously. Do you want to work on some projects that we have here?" And so, given the scale and the size and also the poor reputation that Viapath had, the former company is GTEL, and they rebranded to Viapath, and they used to just focus on the phone systems, but during COVID, we're able to get tablets inside prisons, build some tech platforms, on there. And I see it as, and I still do to this day, see it as a really huge opportunity to change the whole system, really specifically the way reentry is done. But also, I believe that reentry starts day one of incarceration, right? So the sooner, like you mentioned, the sooner you get your mind wrapped around like, hey, I'm going through reentry right now, even if you're doing long sentence, short sentence, right? You're in reentry right now. What are you doing to prepare for getting out, right? I think that, that's the real opportunity that Viapath has too. So I've been doing some work with them for about 3 years now. And we've done a lot of cool things. There's a lot of cool things on the forefront as well. But so between that, real estate, and I do some other investments, now too, but that's really where things are at.
And despite all of that, he still has time to volunteer with our little nonprofit where we're going to try and help people inside start preparing for a better path when they come home. I've known so many people who, while they were serving time, they would say, and you probably heard this, Seth, that the best way to serve time is just to forget about the world outside and focus on your time in here.
It's tough.
And anybody who tells you that is just really not your friend. There's somebody who's really doesn't understand, because you've got to start thinking today about all the challenges that are waiting. And that's what I asked Seth to volunteer with us, to try and help us communicate. And what I would hope that you see as you're going through this course, this masterclass, is the importance of you and what you're going to do. You've got to be investing in yourself today and be the CEO of your life. And we show you how to do that. We offer you a platform that you could start doing that, so that you're recording all of the steps that you're taking, and that will put you on a pathway for hopefully arguing for an earlier transition to society, whether it's through home confinement or a work release program. If you're going to pursue a job, it may be a pathway so that you have jobs and income opportunities waiting for you when you come home. Or potentially, you might want to work toward executive clemency, or any other type of relief. And if you want to do that, you've got to be thinking about the stakeholders ahead. And I want to talk with you a little bit about that, Seth, because I know it's something that interests you, and I want to help you build a path toward executive clemency. But may I ask you, do you know anything about that pattern? And if you do, I'd like to hear what you know. If you don't, then ask me and I'll share with you what I know.
Yeah, I mean, I know probably just enough to get my ass kicked, right? So, I know I've talked to a couple attorneys, a couple groups, and obviously working now with white collar advisors, on that process there, and I've learned a lot from Justin and his team. And I think one of the things is, having an argument to say, why are you a good candidate for clemency, right? And what have you done? Have you learned your lesson, for one, and what are you doing to, kind of help society in the process too? So that's pretty much the extent that I know about it.
Well, let me share with you what I've learned, and I will put some links on here that may be helpful for anybody who is trying to learn. From interviews that I've done with people who used to be employed at the pardon office of the United States Pardon Office. So when first of all, anybody can apply for a pardon. Or executive clemency, and there are different forms of executive clemency. The executive clemency is codified in the United States Constitution, and only the President of the United States can grant clemency. But there are different types. One of them is a pardon, and a pardon historically is only considered for people who've been beyond their release date for 5 years. So under President Trump, that 5-year doesn't matter, because the Constitution doesn't say 5 years. It's the process, the policy that says 5 years. The Constitution says the president has the authority to pardon anybody without, nobody can question the president if he pardons somebody. And President Trump, throughout both of his terms, he's pardoned people who, even before they went to prison. I mean, the first pardon that I remember was under his first term. He pardoned Sheriff Arpaio from Arizona. He hadn't even gone to prison yet, and he pardoned him. Okay, so although historically it's been 5 years after, the president has the authority to use his discretion on a pardon. And a pardon is effectively, we'd like to describe it as a forgiveness for the offense. It doesn't mean the offense never committed, but it's forgiveness of the offense. And the restoration of many civil rights come from that. That's a pardon. That's one form of executive clemency. Another form is a commutation, and that's applicable to a lot of the people who are in prison. A commutation is the president is commuting the sentence. He's saying, and he could do it any way he wants. He could say, I want you to serve, somebody serving a life sentence, you serve 1 more year and then go home. Okay? Or he said, I'm going to commute your sentence right here and you go home. He may say, I'm going to send you to home confinement. So what he's doing is effectively overriding the federal district court judge who imposed a sentence and said, this is your sentence now. And it could be for both the time that you've served. It can also be for a monetary penalty that you may have. So a commutation is applicable to people as a truncating or shortening or eliminating the sentence. It can be different from a pardon. You can still be a felon and have a commutation. An example of that was Scooter Libby under President Bush. He got a commutation, not a pardon, before he went to prison. I think that the guy with the bow tie, I forgot his name. It doesn't matter. So the president can give you an executive clemency, but it could be a pardon, but a commutation. It could also be another form, which is amnesty. Amnesty is a blanket forgiveness. An example of that was during the Carter administration. He granted amnesty to anybody who left the United States because they objected to the Vietnam War. So soldiers who left the United States to Canada or some other country, they would have been felons and prosecuted for desertion because they didn't register for the draft or something like that. But he granted amnesty so they could never be prosecuted. There's one other form of executive clemency, as I recall. I think it's called remission of a fine, and that only has to do to the fine. They could also postpone sentencing. So the president has a tremendous amount of power, but that power is typically brought into a process in the Department of Justice. So if somebody wants to go through executive clemency, as Seth said, the time to start is today. Don't wait until you're out. The reason I asked Seth to tell me his whole story is because I would like to know his whole story to assist him in the best way that I can in positioning a clemency petition. And you should be thinking about that if you're watching this video inside of a prison. Start building a record that memorializes all of the ways that you're a great candidate for relief. Think about it today, and you could start architecting that path. Seth has been on it for a long time, but you might be in a detention center right now. Start thinking about when there might come a time in your future that you want to pursue executive clemency. What's going to happen?
Things that's great. Sorry to interrupt you, Michael, but I just want to add on to that. Like being able to, you said it specifically, memorialize it, right? And your platform wasn't around when I was down, but it would have been amazing to have that because it's such a tough thing to carry around the paperwork and the this and all the, everything that's going on, and then bringing it out and running it through the halfway house and all that stuff. And having a platform like yours to memorialize that.
Well, the other thing about it is it's time stamped. It can't be faked. Okay.
Gotcha.
If you typed it and wrote about or sent it to us and our nonprofit helps you build your profile, it's going to show, look at every month how much he's done. So it can't be faked. It's time stamped. It exists, and it's verifiable, and it's in real time. It's public. So think about that as using it as an asset in the same way that you would be building a resume. If you want to go get a job or something along those lines, sometimes an employer is going to want to see a curriculum vitae or a resume. Let me see what you've done and the value that you could bring. It also shows you as being self-directed and a self-starter. And you don't have to wait to get a certificate from the prison system because you're showing everything that you've done. And that's super important. But now let's talk about the actual process of going through it not under President Trump, who is more willing to look at an unconventional path to a pardon. Okay. And we're going to talk about that. But even if you're going to pursue that path, you are going to want to go through the channels. And the channels are, you can go to if you're in the federal system, you can go to justice.gov. And if you go to justice.gov, the forms are right there. So you will see the pardon form right on justice.gov. You don't need a lawyer. Okay. A lawyer may help you, but you don't need a lawyer. You can do this on your own. And I'm going to help Seth with his, but to the extent he's willing, we'll publish it and let you see what we did. And you could do it, follow that same model. You can't say the same thing that Seth's going to say because his life is different. What's important is what is yours going to say. So let's build an actual petition. And then you have to know, well, what's going to happen. After you've built the petition and you created the supplemental record, you are then going to submit it to the United States Office of the Pardon Attorney. Again, don't need a lawyer to do this. You submit it to the pardon attorney, and then there's going to be a staff pardon attorney there who will review it. And that's the first step. After you've submitted it, they will probably notify you and say, this is just to confirm we've received your pardon application, and it's now going to be under review. And at that point, you're just kind of hanging out. And that hanging out period may last for a long time, but doesn't mean you shouldn't be working on it. And you should know what the government's going to do. So after you've completed the best application and you've submitted it, then the pardon attorney is going to ask the FBI to investigate what you've submitted. So you're submitting this under the penalty of perjury, okay? And that means you don't want to lie because that's a federal crime. So you tell exactly what you're doing, you back it up, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation will then investigate it. What does that investigation mean? Well, they're going to make sure that you didn't lie, number one. Number two, they're going to go very likely speak to the prosecutor who prosecuted your case. And they're going to say, this person is applying for a pardon. What are your thoughts? And get the prosecutor's version of events. Here's the application. And the prosecutor, you don't know what the prosecutor is going to say. But you might do something to move the needle by reaching out to the prosecutor and said, hey, you may remember me. This is what happened. I've grown a lot since then. I've built this record, whatever it is, and I would love it if you would support my pardon application, and explain the reasons why, and then say, but if you can't support it, I'm just hoping at least you won't oppose it, because that will help you. Okay? Mm-hmm. Then the FBI is going to also talk to the judge. And so you're going to want to do the same thing with the judge. You're going to want to front run that and write a letter to the judge and explain who you are today, what you've done, why you're a worthy candidate. Ask the judge to support it. But if the judge won't support it, at least ask him not to oppose it and move on. And then what's going to happen? I would anticipate the probation officer. Same thing. Write to the probation officer. I would try to build a letter of support. Now, the pardon application itself, it will only allow you to submit up to 3 letters of support. So choose 3 letters of support, not of the most influential people in the world, but the people who know you best. It can't be your family member. It can't be somebody to whom you're related. It should be somebody who recognizes you as being a worthy candidate for clemency. And that is one step. The next step that I would do if I was pursuing a pardon is I would build more support. So I'll give you an example of Ross Ulbricht. Many people may know Ross. He's pretty famous for having launched the Silk Road. And he got arrested around the same time I was getting out of prison in 2012. But he was very fortunate in that he built this huge body of support that lobbied on his behalf. And that was the crypto community, the libertarian community. And I mean, I was traveling in Washington, D.C., and I remember going to speak at a university there, and I saw billboards, Free Ross, in like 2019 or 2020 or so. So he had a very big movement that lasted all the way through the 12 years that he served. And it was because of that big movement that the president pardoned his sentence within his first 24 hours of office this term. So things can happen, but it's a long process. If you build support, you can maybe influence the president, but if you can't, you need to be thinking about the process. So then now there's a pardon czar, and that is Alice Johnson, somebody who formerly served time in prison. So you want to build a pathway that might get Alice to advocate on your behalf. You might want to get a pathway that's getting other influential people to support your petition. And all of this is being accumulated at the U.S. Pardon Attorney's Office. The U.S. Pardon Attorney ultimately will make a decision on whether they want to advance you as a candidate for a pardon, pass, and be indifferent to it, or reject you as a candidate. There's no appeal. So nobody has a right to a pardon. Everybody has a right to apply, but nobody has a right to it. After it all goes down, the next step is going to be for the pardon attorney to make that recommendation and then pass it along to the White House. And it would go to the White House, but it would go to a staff attorney in the White House, probably the Office of the General Counsel. And the Office of General Counsel would review it and make a recommendation, and then it would go to the Chief of Staff, and the Chief of Staff then would decide when to bring it to the president. So that is the story that I got from an interview I did, a two-part interview I did with Sam Morrison, who used to be with the U.S. Pardon Attorney's Office. And I'll put a link to that audio file so for anybody to listen. But what's most important is that you are building this strategy in a coherent, deliberate, intentional way. And Seth has been working on this path since the time he learned how to play the guitar in prison. And we're going to try and build a successful application and then try to keep moving. So I would encourage Seth to continue his work with Viapath and trying to influence the lives of 1 million people in prison. But I would also ask you as a member of our community to think about what you can do, because we are always trying to open more pathways from prison to the office of the pardon attorney. And one thing I'll always say is that nobody should work harder for your liberty than you. So start building your record today, and we'll try to give you examples of what they look like. They'll be available right on our website, and you could sit there and look at it, and hopefully you'll be able to push your way through. And Seth, that's what I wanted to share with you today. Just do a live conversation, but also share it with members of our community. But maybe you have some questions for me.
Yeah, super helpful. Thanks for running through that process too. It gives a lot of light that I didn't know about. So yeah, I don't know if I have any specific questions. I'm excited to get the ball rolling and see. You say touch base with the judge and the prosecuting attorney.
Well, that's iterative, right? The first step is going to be, let's put together the best application we could possibly do. That's going to be step one. Then step two is that, are we ready? Is it good? Then submit it. But when we're submitting it, at the same time we're submitting it, let's simultaneously be writing to all of the people that we think can be influential in this process. And that's what we'll do together.
No, it makes sense. One of the things I'll share with you and your audience too, that's listening to this, is that, going down the sovereign citizens pathway, right? Like in that framework, it's taboo to have an attorney, right? You've given up you've deemed yourself incompetent to represent yourself, right, in court, et cetera. So I represented myself in federal court, and I was going down this path of going, oh boy, I don't know what's happening here. Like, I don't know what's going on. And so the prosecuting attorney was tough, but also very fair. The judge, actually looking back, on it, I've read my transcripts and things, and I kind of just shake my head and go, man, he was very lenient with me, gave me a lot of opportunities and that too. So, but it will be interesting, to write that letter and go through that next chapter for sure.
Great. Well, anyway, that concludes a masterclass. There's going to be a lesson here. And with this lesson, if you want to do your part, you will see that I will prompt you with questions. And your job is to work through those questions in an honest way. And if you're doing the right thing, you're also going to be publishing your responses on a profile that you build at Prison Professors Talent. The purpose of that website that we fund is to help you start building and memorializing this journey, right? It's never too early and it's never too late to start building your path to success. But the sooner you start, the more robust of a story you can build. That's what I did. It's the reason I'll say I'll never ask you to do something I didn't do. And it made all the difference in my life. And I believe it can make the difference in other people's lives too. And Seth, I just want to thank you for being a volunteer with our nonprofit and sharing your story. And let's go change the world.
Let's do it. Sounds great, Michael. Thanks.